continue to follow the latest on the case that involves a Massachusetts Air National Guardsman who's accused of leaking highly classified military documents. He appeared in federal court in Worcester yesterday for a detention hearing, but the judge put off an immediate decision on whether he should be kept in custody. Western Mass News reporter Kristen Burnell joins us live in studio after getting answers on the new information revealed. Kristen.
Chris, during yesterday's hearing, prosecutors labeled Jack Teixeira's past as troubling. I spoke with a local expert who shared what might come next in this high-profile case.
The Massachusetts Air National Guardsman accused of leaking highly classified military documents appeared in federal court on Thursday. But the judge overseeing the case in Worcester did not make an immediate decision on whether Jack Teixeira should be kept in custody until trial or released to home confinement at his father's home in Massachusetts.
A pretty standard hearing in terms of the government trying to hold the defendant, not surprising given what he allegedly did. I'd be stunned if they did not actually hold him.
Local attorney Jeremy Powers speaking with Western Mass News following new revelations at Thursday's hearing. Prosecutors detailed a troubling history going back to high school in 2018, when Teixeira was suspended after a classmate overheard him make remarks about weapons, including Molotov cocktails, guns at the school, and racial threats. Teixeira's attorney then responded that he underwent a psychiatric evaluation, and Teixeira returned to school a few days later. Retired United States military officer Gary Lafort tells us why Teixeira was allowed to join the Air National Guard given his past.
There is an extensive search background investigation generally done by the FBI. The high school incident did in fact come up, and the argument that was used by Teixeira is that he was young at the time. He's now a mature young man, learned from his mistakes, and moving forward, he recognized the importance of the position that he was being given.
The fort also weighing in on the arguments from prosecutors that he is a flight risk and should remain in federal custody as he awaits trial.
The prosecution was also concerned that he may still have classified documents in his possession. And the concern is that a hostile nation is very well aware of this and might approach him and try to help him escape. Teixeira's lawyer made the case that he did not present a flight risk. He was only a 21-year-old young man. Where could he go?
And as for the judge ultimately not yet making a decision about what's next for Teixeira, Attorney Powers says
it's not uncommon for a judge to consider both the government and the defense perspective on holding a person. They'll take matters under advisement and typically issue a decision within a few days.
Now, the judge did not say when we can expect a decision to be made. Reporting live in studio, Kristen Burnell, Western Mass News.